But we defined open access back then as very loosely as literature that's digital, online, free of charge, free of most copyright and licensing restrictions. Of course, since then, there's been a lot of development, particularly in the areas of Creative Commons, and we have some people who are deeply involved in Creative Commons here. Kelsey right there, so wave your hand, Kelsey, so people can come to chat with you about Creative Commons later. But what I really also want to emphasize, though, is that open access, to me, is more of a set of philosophical principles than a set of conditions or licenses. Those are the technical definitions of open access, if you will. I think this is a technical definition. They're important, but to me, there are a set of principles that underlie open access that, to me, are often not talked about enough. So I just want to remind us about that. In terms of what scholarly communications is about, and those of us involved in scholarly communication knows that we do peer review without any monetary expectation. Is I'll do this and I'll do this for you, you do this for me. It is a community agreement, and it is so-called the gift economy. So the gift itself is what we do for each other, and in exchange, we expand the sphere of knowledge, but to be more practical, we do get things in return in the sense of we get our publication, we get our professional recognitions, we get our hiring and our promotions and grants, and all those are based on our scholarly records, right? So increasingly, as everybody well knows, it is the publish or perish paradigm that drives academic recognitions and reward system. But again, I want to emphasize that open access was attractive to me because it opened up other possibilities of participation and different way of valuing scholarly knowledge. And again, I will try to convince you of that. And through my own experience working with colleagues from many parts of the world, I came to value open access as a way to really opening up the boundaries of what's so-called research and what's legitimate knowledge, and how we could better integrate the three things we're supposed to do in a university, which is teaching, research, and community services. Of course, our evaluations are mostly based on research. We pay lip services to teaching, community service. You could probably not do any, and you will get away with it, as long as you have a good research record, by and large, right? And so open access really allowed us to open that conversation about how we redress these kind of imbalance of favoritism of one form of the university missions over the other. I throw this in because this is just a lot of recent examples of how scientists, scholars, students are actively engaged in open access in terms of their discovery and sharing of the results, and how quickly these kind of scientific discovery could be integrated into teaching, and then attracting students into the research enterprise. Because again, our teaching business in the school is really just to teach, and we don't really integrate a lot in terms of teaching and research. So I think increasingly open access, one of the attractions to me is that a student could participate early on in the research process and actually share out their research as a knowledge creator. It is that much more of an incentive for them to be more interested in the knowledge, in the value of creating knowledge in a collaborative way. And this afternoon you will hear many different practitioners, scholars that are doing this kind of things very actively, so I look forward to learning more about them myself. Again, just to emphasize this, that open access is attractive because it is, at least promises these various types of potentials in terms of inclusive collaborations. But there's always a but, right? Changing the narratives of what I just said, changing the narratives to go back to the missions of the university is tough, right? I mean, we like to say, okay, this is what we would like to do, but the reality is quite different. So I went on you know, like any good researchers, I went to Google and say, okay, type in university missions. And I just took the top 3 or 4 of them in my last Google search. And the top one came up was, I think it's UCLA. Yeah, it is UCLA. And it was fairly actually simple taglines. It's our core values and mission is education, research, and services, right? This, I think, is typical of most universities across North America and to some extent in Europe. Not unusual. This was interesting to me. This is University of Alberta. They have it front and center on the university mission statement that they are there for the public good. And then they've gone on to spell out how their research and their education is oriented towards providing the public good in terms of dissemination of research, community engagement, and various types of activities. Right? So it was one of the few universities that I actually see this statement actually made explicit, even though we talk about it a lot. So my own university actually have a mission statement. A few years ago, I looked everywhere. I couldn't find one. There were a lot of plan, there were a lot of roadmap, but there was actually not clear mission statement. So I was able to find one recently, and I'm delighted to see that the mission statement of the University of Toronto does have a lot of references to equitable principles of knowledge making and sharing. So principle of equal opportunity, equity, and justice were highlighted throughout the text. So I was very pleased with at least the text. But of course, when you look at the publicity material from the University of Toronto, you see over and over again, I get these bulletins in my email. And every 2 weeks, there's a new bulletin about university ranking. This new university rankings that U of T is one of the top whatever, and this university rankings that university is the top university in Canada, and on, right? And the THE is the Time Higher Education publication that also published university ranking and is read by many university administrators, and increasingly people our university are trying to get on the list at the top 20, top 10, top 5 as a way to market the university's attraction to potential students and to future faculties, right? When I ask my students, particularly international students in my class, how many of them check the ranking before they come to the school, actually, can I get show of hands if your students actually check the university's ranking before you apply? Anybody? Okay, great, all right. So these university rankings do play a part in the recruitment, but if you look at the criteria of these kind of ranking is primarily based on publications and citation and grant money. Again, there's next to no mention of teachings and university services and their public mission. Right? There's no criteria in these rankings, right? And so, so despite what the mission statement says, there's a mismatch between what university aspire to be and what university end up being in terms of a market-driven economy. And so there are lots of questions, and I'm not going to try to answer them all, and these are questions that keep popping up. Every time I think about open access, there are different questions that we need to address. And essentially, these questions tends to be not talked about, and that's why I raised them. And I said, one of the things that we really need to think about is broadening the meaning of scholarships and research. Lorraine asked earlier, how many of the people in this room consider themselves scientists? And I think that question is problematic because, again, the notion of a scientist itself is very much of contextually defined and time-defined notion, right? Ask that question 50 years ago, the answer might be quite different. Today, the definition is quite strict, I would think. And people seem to know who the scientists are, who the humanists are, who the historians are, who the artists are. But I would argue that in terms of scholarship, and I'll show you the more detailed argument, in terms of scholarship, we do pretty much the same thing, but increasingly our institution demand that we separate ourselves into ways of doing things that can be categorized and marketed differently. And so as a result, we have very different criteria about what constitutes scholarship, what constitutes excellence, what constitutes real knowledge, and so forth. And a lot of other knowledges are ignored in the process. I'm glad recently I was reading University Affairs that there are other colleagues out there who are trying to push back at these kind of productivity-driven metrics that about quantity of publications, about grant monies, about how many grad students you brought in and how many undergraduate you filled the seats. I always tell my undergraduate one of the most interesting terms that I learned when I was administrator in my department was a term called BIU. Do anybody know what BIU is? To describe undergraduate students. Yeah?
Basically community.
Right, okay, so undergraduate students are BIU because they bring in X number of dollars. Each person we bring to fill the seats. And over the years, I've learned a lot of these formula in my school. And it is nothing to do with academics. It's more about what's the mortgage payment and how many seats we need to fill in order to pay for the mortgage, for the buildings and so forth. So increasingly, we have a disconnect in terms of the university and the kind of missions that we have, and productivities becoming more and more of a metrics on how we perform. And it's not only about publication, it's about teaching as well. And so our teachings now are all based on so-called outcome-based. We are asked to come up with curriculums that define the outcomes. And increasingly, we're asked to say, well, how are students going to get success in jobs? How do you know that these kind of program is going to lead to employment down the road, right? And this is not new to most of you, those who work in an academic setting. And those kind of pressures are becoming much more acute. Now, the other kind of pressures that I've been personally been very aware of is this notion of knowledge equity. So some 20-odd years ago when I started doing my PhD, I realized a lot of this literature that I wanted for my own thesis, literatures that were published in India, in Indonesia, in South Africa, in Thailand, in other parts of the world, were simply not accessible to me, even though my library owns access to lots and lots of journals through these big packages through the big publishers. So I could get thousands of e-journals from the global north publishers, but nothing from any publisher from the global south. And I asked the librarians in my school, and basically they told me that, well, they're not in the package, so we don't get them. We just subscribe to these big packages, too much work to subscribe to each of these small journals for $10 US here, $5 US there. These are very low cost, but very hard to get a hold of. So it was a management issue as much. But they also learned that some criteria was that, oh, well, these are journals from India, there's some journals from Kenya, they must not be very good because they don't have real peer review, and on and on. So as a result, a lot of these journals from other parts of the world were simply not considered part of our knowledge base in the institution, in the kind of research access that I had been able to. So when the internet came along, when open access came along, the fantasy I have was say, well, this is a system we have now. We're the global north who's providing knowledge for the rest of the world. We transfer knowledge to the rest of the world. We export knowledge to the world because we're the powerhouses of knowledge making. And so could we change this notion of the north being the center of excellence and knowledge producing to the idea of having the internet playing out as being a truly egalitarian system where knowledge could be seen as disseminated through different nodes without any centers or periphery. And I said fantasy because that was 20 some odd years ago, and that was a very idealistic view about the internet. But of course, the way we understand the internet now, internet is not that kind of open, completely bilateral. If you look at the traffic of the webs today, most of the four big sites, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and can't remember the fourth one, takes up about 70% of the web traffic. And likewise, if you look at scholarly communication literature, most of the traffic, again, are dominated by the big commercial publisher from the global north. So after some 20 some odd years, my answer to this question was I was overly optimistic and idealistic that somehow this kind of open architecture of peer-to-peer exchange would disrupt the existing power structures of scholarly communication, which is completely controlled by a set of global north standards. And these kind of standards create a kind of inequity sometimes we don't think about in a concrete way, and I'll show you some example. And this is a map that haunts me all the time, and this is a map, even though it's a few years old, depicts the world according to the Thomson ISI's in that Journal Impact Factors and Citation Index. Many of you are familiar with, right? So Thomson ISI has this instrument called Impact Factor and Citation that tracks all the journal articles that cite other journal articles, and then they can tell you how many times your papers is cited, or how many papers published from each country's university, and so forth. So this cartographic map is proportional to the number of publications and citation to the country that generated those publications. So you can see the United States, the big purple piece, is very, very bloated. So in other words, it has way more citation relative to its population size. And then Europe and UK in particular in the center, the little kidney thing is very prominent. Japan in the far right is the other purple, is very prominent. And that little stick in the center piece there, that's the whole entire continent of Africa. And it is not for South Africa, the whole continent would be invisible altogether. So when you look at the world, according to the Thomson's database, much of the developing world or this global South is simply invisible, that you would get the impression that there are no knowledge being created from those parts of the world. And I came to understand that these is obviously the artifacts of a particular way of seeing the world. And this particular way of seeing the world has created what some scholars have called cognitive injustice, that is, a wholesale disregard for different ways of knowing and knowledge generated from outer part of the world because of the way knowledge is being legitimized in a certain way by the global north. And so the result of these kind of process have excluded not only knowledge, but also researchers, scientists, scholars from the global south from participating in the dialogues about knowledge and what relevance their research has for their own local needs. And I'll tell you this story. Professor Mary Onyango, and I have a link at the bottom, and you can get to the slide later and watch the full interview I did with her. I met Professor Onyango a number of years ago and found out that she has been a dedicated researcher on African indigenous vegetables. And she's been spending the last 3 decades looking at a lot of these indigenous vegetables that when she was growing up, she was accustomed to eating, from her grandmother and so forth. These were highly nutritious vegetables. Many of them are considered wild growing. Many of them are not vegetables that we're familiar with. But the sad part too was that these are vegetables that most of her contemporary and of course the younger generation have completely forgotten in favor of broccolis and celeries and carrots and corn that are being imported from the global north. So when she started doing research on these topics, she found out that there were still farmers who were still cultivating these crops, but they weren't finding markets. So one thing Mary did was to work with farmers, So I mean, we need to develop different recipes and tastes and way to market these vegetables. And the reason these vegetables are so important, not only because they're indigenous, because they grow much better than the imported vegetables. They're drought resistant, they are highly nutritious, and they're abundant once you're able to grow them. And yet, when she tried to publish her research, she first sent them to Global North, the well-known journals from the North, because working in university in the Global South, you have the same kind of pressure that you have to publish, but you have to publish it in international journals in order to be recognized. So she sent her manuscripts to some of these Western journals. And she got back from one of the reviewers that you sent your paper to the wrong journal. We do not review paper on weeds. And so this reviewer basically rejected what she was studying on the basis that this reviewer from the Global North simply could not consider these vegetables as crops. So obviously, this guy's weeds is completely disregard a whole lot of important issues about their food sovereignty and their knowledge base. Now, thanks to people like Professor Onyango, she kept at it, and she published in some open access journals, some of which I've been involved with, that are based in Africa. And she was able to get her research out there. She was able to attract young researchers to work with her and to continue to develop her research program locally. And recently she was invited by some Global North institution to give talks on her research, even invited by Global North journals to publish in their journals. So I kind of say you should just say no to them. And other colleagues of mine based in Uganda have been working with also young researchers, entrepreneurs in the agricultural areas. And again, I forgot to put the link here. I'll add the link in later. You'll be very impressed with what some of these young people are doing in Uganda and other eastern part of Africa in terms of agricultural research and innovation. But we don't hear about them, right? So over some 20 years ago, my colleague and I started, again, idealistically, this online platform we call BioLine International, starting to put journals that are published in the Global South into this platform, and we made it freely available. The word open access didn't exist then, but they were all freely available online. In the old days, we actually scanned each of the articles and then correct them, OCR and so forth. It was very, very labor intensive, and all done by volunteers. Continues to be done by volunteers. And as I said earlier, Professor Onyango was able to publish some of her earlier research in also other journals that are based in Kenya. And through these kind of open access journals, her work was cited internationally and also across the continent. And this project was made possible, this BioLine International project was made possible from a group of colleagues of ours that are based in Brazil. And again, we started this 20 some odd years ago, and this is a platform they've been running. And again, we did want to show that it is very low cost, and if you work together collaboratively, you could create scientific communication in ways that is not subjected to all kinds of restrictions. And this is a list of the journals that we've been working with over the years. But having said so much about journals, I want to say we need to think beyond the journals. Journals is actually the problem. And not only is journal the problem, the journal article itself is the problem. And this is a very famous speech given by a physicist, Peter Madelwar, some years ago, in which he suggested that the so-called scientific article that we know, the one that starts with the introductions, the method, the results, the analysis, and the conclusion, he said those kind of scientific papers is essentially a fraud, because it really depicts the scientific discovery process that is so neat and tidy And that majority of scientific discoveries are not done like that. But because in order to get things published, we have to conform to a certain storytelling format, that this is the story you tell, that this is how you came up with the question, this is how you went about doing the research, this is how you get the result, and then magically you somehow prove or disprove your initial hypothesis. And he argued that these kind of scientific papers is fraudulent in terms of representing the complexity and sometimes serendipitous nature of scientific discovery. I point to some early papers in American Anthropologist, one of the long-running anthropologist journal, and if you go back to some early journals, pre-World War II, most papers are not written in the format that we recognize today. I mean, I hear people say, oh, our journal article's been fixed for 250 years. It's not so. The journal articles that we know it, this format is really a post-World War II creation by the commercial publishers in order to standardize journals, publications, and units of sales. And I can show you this, like for example, this journal, World Development, was a privately society-run journal. It's fairly flexible in terms of many of the articles in the early days. When Elsevier took it over, all the journal format articles are formatted in identical way. So you can look at the far left, my far left, that article could be any article in any of the Elsevier journal. It would look exactly the same, whether it's a social science journal, or whether it's a biology journal, or whether it's a chemistry journal, right? You all recognize that format of how it's been structured. And argue that these structures really allow them to standardize the unit of sales, and we're all familiar with how much it costs if you don't have the subscription. And I'm really dumbfounded increasingly how much restrictions publishers are putting on, even with a lot of the costs that they're putting on. So you could actually pay $15 only to read, right? You can read it for a day or two and then it disappears from your computer. Or you can actually download it, but then you still can't share it, right? Because if you try to share that PDF that you downloaded, there's all kinds of tracking that's built in, and in theory, you're violating their policy, so you could be prosecuted for sharing something illegally, right? So the kind of control that big publishers put on restrictions are actually getting more and more severe. And recently, a study from a group of researchers from Montreal found that now in some disciplines, psychology for example, most of the journals now are completely published by a small number of commercial publishers. So what I'm trying to get at is that despite what we've been saying about open access, despite what we say in terms of optimism we have about open access, what we have seen in the last few years is that commercial publishers are actually getting stronger and stronger, and they're getting richer and richer because of the other model, so-called article processing fee for open access, that you can actually pay these publishers in order to get your article published. So there are no signs that commercial control of publishing continue. Now, the other insidious side of commercial publishing, one in terms of the exclusion that I talked about with Professor Onyango, the other has been well observed. Richard Horton has been a long-time editor of the very, very famous journal, The Lancet, and the most recognized journal in medicine. But he recognized early on that when you look at the editorial board members of the top medical journals, the BMJ, the Lancet, the Journal of American Medical Association, and all of that, there are literally no board members from the Global South in some of those titles. For Lancet, it was a little bit better. Now, this was 2003. Things have improved a bit. But according to Horton, the consequence of these kind of asymmetry of global North presence is that the journal have tended to publish things that are of interest only to the global North. And as a result, you have whole huge 90% of the human population whose disease burdens are much heavier are not talked about. And so many of you are very aware of the 10-90 gap, 10% of research monies is spent on 90% of the people who are suffering from a majority of the diseases. And Horton thinks that the journal publishing system has a part to play with it. And because the journal has to cater to their citation metrics, they don't want to publish an article has to do with a disease in Africa and so forth. So one of my colleagues who started a journal for African health sciences 15 years ago, he was so frustrated because he couldn't get any of his articles on sleeping sickness published in a Western journal. Same thing. So, well, they won't get citation of an article on sleeping sickness back in 2003 in Lancet. We will have low citation. Low citation means lower journal impact factor. So the editors are forced to think of which articles would bring the biggest number of citation, and those decisions are then made with those in mind. And if you think that I'm exaggerating, talk to some of these editors and they could admit it, and will admit it in a more honest moment. So these kind of commercial consideration has a very detrimental effects on medicine. This is according to Horton. And this is, again, not new. It's been around, understanding, but nothing has really been done about it, and that's an amazing thing. So if you look at the representation of the journal articles and scientists, it's very much the same. Now, so the journal articles is a fraud. The journal itself, to me, is a bigger fraud. And it's been the center of a lot of problem in terms of exclusion of global equity. This is a famous paper written by Tim Berners-Lee outlining what this thing called a hypertext transfer protocol could do for research sharing and communication. It was not a paper published in a journal article, it was just an internal report that Tim Berners-Lee submitted to his manager. And some of you will remember that the manager famously said, and is highlighted on the top there, it says, vague but interesting, right? So that was his review, vague but interesting. But of course we know how this thing called the World Wide Web have changed practically everything we know about everything today, right? But it was never published in a scientific journal. So I want to come back to this notion, as I said earlier, about who a scientist is and who a historian is and who an artist is. And so a scholar by the name of John Unsworth, been a leader in the digital humanities areas, have argued that it doesn't matter what discipline you're in. As researchers, scholars, you go through a very similar set of process. You try to discover what the problem are, you start to gather notes and research materials, start to annotate them, you start to compare cases to say, oh, is this similar to that? And you start to make references to earlier work, you build on earlier work, and because generally the corpus of materials that we look at are large, you cannot study them all, so you need to sample them, you need to justify your sampling, and then you need to then tell stories about those sampling, and ultimately you get to represent the whole process itself, right? So as I said earlier, our system has been privileged towards the journal article itself. So everything we do in every discipline stream towards that journal article. Now in the humanities, the monograph is still king, but increasingly in the social sciences is the journal article as well. And so it's this representing part that has been seen very little change, right? That the journal article is still stuck with most of the institutional framing. And yet there's so much that we could do in terms of that representation. So I'm looking to some other areas of scholarship and to think more broadly about what scholarship means. And again, there are a lot of similarities across discipline. Doesn't matter what discipline you are in, you still go through this kind of process. I was happy to come across some really relevant literature by people who are looking at teaching, learning, and services. And as far back as the 60s and 70s and the 80s, there were a lot more discussion about university role in public engagement. One of the well-known authors who commissioned have written a number of reports on this notion of scholarship of engagement, he argues that most of the time we're focusing on the scholarship of discovery. But we don't pay enough attention to the scholarship of integration and application and the scholarship of teaching. And that teaching itself is a form of scholarship that is based on research and research-informed practices. And so he has a set of ideas in terms of how we could better engage in what he called scholarship of engagement, but particularly his understanding of scholarship of engagement is to open up the richness of the university to the community, to the local communities who could make use of them, who are able to benefit from the research and from the expertise that are housed in that university. And so, again, I'm back to my original contention, right, that we tend to have this in our mission statement, but we don't tend to practice it because in reality it's very difficult to conceive. And so in the digital environment, in the open access environment, I'm seeing a lot of opportunities. Many of my colleagues do translations, do what they call knowledge mobilization, they do curations of data sets, they do software writing, they do all kinds of things that were not traditionally counted as scholarship. So I would say that all these are forms of scholarship that need to be recognized. And again, we need to rethink how we could tell better stories about what we do in the university. Happy to see there are other colleagues who are calling for similar things. That they're doing these kind of work in their local university. There's a very interesting cross-Canada project called Participedia where researchers work with their students. One of my colleagues and some of my students are working on this, providing case studies of different social movement, democratic development in different parts of the world, writing them up as sort of Wikipedia type article, but in a format that it could be used for additional research and teaching. There's this upcoming meeting by increasingly large international organization focusing on democratization of knowledge and mobilization of knowledge. And this is a very global set of communities, and I'm happy to see that this is taking place. So in the afternoon, Lorraine mentioned that I'm going to run on one of the sessions, but I don't want to put too much ideas into it because it's supposed to be an unconference, right? But one of the set of ideas I've been playing with is how do we broaden our narratives, right? About what it is that we need to be doing. So we have tended to focus on the top one, on the business value, the market values of the products of the research. We don't think enough about all the other kind of values. And so our metrics, and I hate the term metrics in itself, our metrics are all geared towards the top couple of them, and not anything about the others. And so I would like some of you or us to have dialogue, thinking about how we can create better narratives that can capture these multiple different values so that we can tell the people, that be the funding agency, the administrators, our colleague, to reconsider the way they represent their knowledge. Right? So I am coming to an end. I started off saying that we now live in a post-truth world, unfortunately, and I think we do have a responsibility to engage our students to make sure that the research that we do are accessible to them. One of my colleagues recently published a book about inclusive development in Latin America, and I want my student to read them, but it costs $150 a copy, and how can I ask my students to read them? And when I tell my colleagues that when you publish a book for that kind of money, or publish your article in a journal that costs the people $49 to read them when they can't afford it, you are essentially creating a form of exclusion. You are perpetuating a neoliberal system that you have sought to critique so thoughtfully in most cases, and yet they fail to see their own scholarly practices as an embodiment of that kind of market-driven system. And so that kind of tensions are, to be honest, very hard to resolve. But I do think that we need to stress them. We need to stress the people's rights to research, that not only, and I think one of the mistakes that open access has made is that we have put too much emphasis on the word access, and not enough on the understanding of participation. And to me, one of the bigger set of problems facing scholars from the Global South, students in the Global South, is their exclusion from participation, their lack of voices, because their works are not deemed legitimate according to other standards. So open access is, again, as I really wanted to reiterate, it's not about getting access. It's about being able to transform, contest the existing power structures that control who can produce and who can share knowledge and who knowledge really counts. And finally, I hear a lot of people who are proposing alternative metrics, and I say a lot of these alternative metrics are not alternative at all. If you look and think of these alternative metrics that are being embedded in a lot of the journal commercial publications, they're owned by the same people. They're owned by the same large company. These large companies now are increasingly buying up any scholarly infrastructures. Many of you know Elsevier had bought the SSR and the Social Science Research Network, which is a preprint for social science. They bought Mendeley earlier, and all these kind of big commercial publishers can buy up a lot of the infrastructure that are now increasingly controlling, again, scholarly legitimacy. So I would say what we need is not more alternative metrics, which are not really alternatives, but actually alternatives about alternatives to how we think about metrics. I think that's a very different proposition. And again, I don't have a clear answers. It is one of those things that I'm searching, and any input from you would be happily accepted. So I'm going to stop here and I hope I have 5 minutes or so for questions.
Okay, 10.
10, okay, wow, great. Okay. Questions?